Hello, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Evernight, March's alter ego who relies on constantly blowing up her Memo Sprite while providing buffs to herself and allied Memo Sprites to deal big PP damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, Lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so some things could still change when her banner drops. Let's first start with her skill, which is the ability you would be spamming the most in combat. First of all, it consumes 10% of Evernight's HP to summon her Memo Sprite EV, after which it provides all ally Memo Sprites with a crit damage buff based on 24% of her own crit damage, which lasts for 2 of Evernight's turns. It is important to note that just like Casteries, Evernight's skill consumes HP and not SP to activate, which makes her very SP friendly. But aside from this, her skill also heals 50% of her Memo Sprite's HP if it's already on field, while giving her 2 Memoria every time you use this skill. But the neat thing is, if Evernight is in her darkest riddle state, this skill gives an additional 12 points of Memoria. Which brings us to her ultimate, which does a couple of things while looking pretty damn badass. First of all, it summons her Memo Sprite if it isn't on field, while dealing 200% of EV's max HP as AoE damage. But aside from this, it enables Evernight to enter the darkest riddle state, which lasts until 2 of these charge points indicated by this buff is consumed by EV's self-destruct attack, which we'll get to later. Now, while in the darkest riddle state, Evernight and EV gains a 60% damage buff, becomes immune to crowd control debuffs like freeze, and finally, all enemies take 30% more damage as long as the state is up. And it's a pretty cool Easter egg, the animation of most of Evernight's abilities also change while she's in this state. Now, as much as possible, you want to be using Evernight's ult as often as you can to maximize her damage and maintain the uptime of Darkest Riddle. However, it does have an energy cost of 240, which makes it one of the most expensive ults in the game. But thankfully, her A4 passive helps with her ults and Darkest Riddle's uptime. First of all, it gives Evernight 70 energy and 1 Memoria at the start of combat. But aside from this, it also gives Evernight 5 energy and 1 Memoria every time she or any Memo Sprite in the party uses an ability. Now, let's move on to her Jellyfish Memo Sprite, which is named EV is automatically summoned at the start of combat with an initial speed of 160 and a max HP equal to 50% of Evernight's current max HP. And aside from this, EV is also immune to all crowd control debuffs and has a significantly higher aggro value. And as long as it's on field, both EV and Evernight will deal 50% more damage, though it's also worth noting that every time EV is summoned, it will automatically take action. And every time Evernight or EV loses HP, they gain 2 Memoria and a 60% crit damage buff for 2 turns. Just note, this effect can only trigger once per target for each received attack. Now, Evi's first attack is a single target hit that automatically selects a target but prioritizes the enemy that Evernight last attacked. It also deals ice damage equal to 50% of EV's max HP, and for every Memoria Evernight has, it also deals bonus damage. This is all on top of generating 1 Memoria every time it's used. But speaking of which, Memoria is Evernight's main resource that is indicated by this number and is required to use EV's strongest attack, and her gameplay revolves around stacking as much of these as you can. You get 2 Memoria whenever Evernight or EV loses HP, 2 from her skill, but if Darkest Riddle is active, you get 14 from her skill instead. You also get 1 every time a Memo Sprite or Evernight uses an ability, 1 from her Memo Sprite's regular attack, 1 at the start of combat, and finally 1 from her technique. Now the neat thing is, when Evernight reaches 16 or more Memoria, she dispels crowd control debuffs and becomes immune to them. And if Evie is on field, it immediately takes action. After which, its strongest attack, Dreams Dissolving as Dew, becomes available, which has Evie use Self-Destruct to deal massive AoE damage. Now for every point of Memoria Evernight has, this attack deals 12% of Evie's max HP as ice damage to the primary target and 6% to other enemies. So this attack will deal a minimum of 228% of Evie's max HP to the primary target and 114 to other enemies at 19 Memoria, which is the bare minimum you'll have when activating the skill due to Evernight's passives. However, it's important to note that Memoria has no cap, and you can easily go above 16 stacks to a combination of enemy hits, high scene signature, Memo Sprite turns, and well-timed RMC action advances. But moving on, it's also worth noting that when EV disappears, it increases Evernight speed by 10%. And for every 1 Memoria consumed by every self-destruct attack, the speed buff increases by 1% with a cap of 40 Memoria. In total, this can give Evernight up to 50% bonus speed at 40 Memoria, and given you play Evernight correctly, this can help her reach speed breakpoints like 134 without any speed boosts or substats. However, it's very important to note that you need to reach at least 26 stacks of Memoria for you to reach 134 speed with this ability alone. As for her A2 passive, it increases Evernight's and Evie's crit rate by 35% in battle, which of course makes her significantly easier to build. Aside from this, every time they use an ability, it consumes 5% of either Evie's or Evernight's max HP to increase their crit damage by 15%. Which of course means that due to their talent, any of either Evie's or Evernight's abilities can generate 2 Memoria. But finally, every time Evie uses her self-destruct attack, it recovers 1 SP, which makes Evernight completely SP positive since her skill uses HP to activate. Moving on to her A6 passive, it increases all Memo Spread's crit damage based on the number of Remembrance units in the team, going from a 5% crit damage buff with 1 unit all the way to 65% with an entire party of Remembrance units. And finally, her technique, Let Rain Cold on V, which just automatically applies the crit damage buff from her skill to all Memo Sprites at the start of combat.
With her kit out of the way, we can talk about her Eidolons.
Her E1 increases the damage dealt by Memo Sprites based on the number of enemies on field, going from a 120% increase based on the original damage dealt with 4 or more enemies, all the way up to a 150 increase with 1 enemy. Now the neat thing is, this damage amp is an entirely new damage multiplier applied after the original damage calculation, meaning it doesn't suffer from diminishing returns, making it insane for improving any Memo Sprite's damage output. While her E2 increases Evernight and Evie's crit damage by 40%, while every time they generate Memoria, the number gained increases by 2. And finally, it enables her ultimate to give 2 additional Darkest Riddle charges. Now, this is a rather insane Eidolon. Not only does it make it so much easier to maintain full uptime of her ult state, it also increases the number and frequency of Evie's self-destruction attacks. And with this Eidolon's increased Memoria gain, each of those attacks will have significantly higher Memoria stacks, meaning even more Evernight damage. As for her E4, it increases all Memo Sprite's weakness break efficiency by 25%, with Evie getting double of this buff. Now, it's kinda weird they gave her this as an E4, but maybe it's just Hoyo hinting at a future break Memo Sprite meta. And finally, for her E6, it provides every party member with a 20% all-type rest pen buff. Aside from this, it refunds 30% of the Memoria consumed by Evie's self-destruct attack.
With her Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones.
Evernight's gorgeous signature increases her max HP by 30% just by equipping it. And whenever Evie uses an ability, Evernight gains the Noctis buff, which enables all Memo Sprites to ignore 20% of the enemy's defense. Aside from this, it also buffs her and Evie's damage by 30%, and whenever Evie disappears, it recovers 8 energy for Evernight. This cone not only improves her damage significantly, but also improves her team utility, allowing her to better support units like Casteries, all on top of helping improve her ult's uptime. Now, the closest alternative to her signature is Casteries' Lightcone. It provides the same 30% HP buff to Evernight, while giving her a 2-turn 30% def ignore whenever her or Evie loses HP. And its 12% action advance after Evie self-destructs is also pretty neat for helping her summon Evie back or building Memoria faster. The only downside to this Lightcone is it doesn't provide the same team utility as her signature. So I suggest keeping this on Casteries if you're using them together, but it's a great option for improving Evernight's personal damage if you're using her as a main DPS. Now, the next best options would be the BP Lightcones, which are pretty great crit stat sticks, with Sweat providing a great Memo Sprite damage buff. But obviously the issue with these are they are paid, expensive, and it takes a while to get copies of. And Evernight also does get quite a bit of crit stats already. As for other options, the story's next page, or any Lightcone with 1058 or above base HP like Baidu's signature are great as HP stat sticks to help with their damage. And lastly, if you're not using it on Hyacine, The Hurt the Shop Lightcone works too, with her appreciating its 1058 base HP and its team-wide 16% damage buff, especially if you're using her as a sub-DPS. Its speed buff also helps guarantee Evernight will hit speed breakpoints despite her volatile speed buff.
But with her Lightcones out of the way, let's look at possible relics.
Now her best set is the new World-Making Deliverer, with it giving 8% bonus crit rate with its 2-piece set. And for its 4-piece side effect, after using a skill or basic while Evie is on field, it increases Evernight's and Evie's HP by 24%, while buffing all allies' damage dealt by 15% until Evernight's next skill or basic. Now this set is pretty much made for her, so it's really the only one you should be going for, but sadly it's new so you can't really pre-farm for it. So with that in mind, a 2-2 combo of either crit, HP, or ice damage can work as temporary options until you can get a good deliverer set. So just choose whichever has the best substats. As for planar sets, she has 2 options, either Arcadia or Demesne. Arcadia is the best, the more meme sprites you can consistently have present on the field, while Demesne is a great option for general use for its HP and crit damage buff. Just note, if you're using Evernight in a Castories team, it's much better to use Demesne, since a lot of the time when Evernight detonates Evie, Castories' dragon won't be on field. And if you're not using the RMC or Hyacine in this team, this leads to Evernight losing 9 to 18% damage from Arcadia's buff. As for a main DPS Evernight, Arcadia is really great for up to a 24% damage buff, but if you don't have Hyacine, you'll only really get 18% from this set. But it's worth noting that due to the RMC's crit damage buff going to Evernight and main DPS teams, Arcadia does have the edge over Demesne, since crit damage stats is already heavily diluted for Evernight in this team.
With her possible sets out of the way, let's talk about stats.
She has a high base HP of 1313 with a low base speed of 99. But aside from this, she gains 18.7% crit rate, 18% HP, and 13.3% crit damage from her traces. This is all on top of her 35% crit rate buff and massive self-crit damage buffs, so make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, you want to crit damage your HP chest, HP boots, an ERR or HP rope, and an HP or ice damage orb. Now for the chest and orb, in most cases crit and ice damage is preferred not only for Evernight's personal damage, but also enable her to give a higher crit damage buff. However, as a sub-DPS for Castories, an HP orb or chest can help generate more new blood to help Castories get her ult faster. As for the rope, HP is preferred for her personal damage and general use. However, if you don't have her signature, an ERR rope is also useful to keep uptime on her ult state for its damage vulnerability debuff. But just don't use it for a main DPS Evernight, since it will cause her damage to drop by quite a bit. As for substats, she is completely HP scaling, so attack stats are useless. But with that in mind, focus on crit rate first, then crit damage, then HP stats. Now it's also worth noting that she gains 61.7% crit rate just from her kit and the deliverer set alone, and this isn't even considering the 10% from the RMC. So with that in mind, try to get as close to 100% crit rate as possible in battle. But if you're having trouble getting crit rate substats, you can go as low as 85%. As for crit damage, she gains up to 218.1% crit damage from her kit and a crit damage chest alone. And that's without considering the RMC's crit damage buff and her skill giving 24% of her total crit damage to Evie. But despite her already getting a lot of it, I recommend going for at least 175 to 200 plus crit damage out of battle. This is in order to have her skill give a bigger crit damage buff to Evie and Castories' Mema Sprite for even more personal and team damage. And lastly, for HP, I recommend going for 7 to 7.5k if you're using a light cone that doesn't give bonus HP, and 8k if the light cone gives bonus HP like her signature.
But with her build out of the way, let's move on to possible teammates.
Now, like I mentioned earlier, she is best paired with Remembrance units, with her best partners being Castories, Hyacine, and the RMC. But let's first discuss Castories, since they benefit from each other so much. Castories' team-wide HP drain is great for generating Memoria, and she is a Remembrance unit which can help get more crit damage from Evernight's trace, all on top of helping generate more energy and Memoria for Evernight. As for Evernight, her constant HP drain and Evie's self-destructions enables her to have such a high rate of HP fluctuations that it generates so much new buff for casteries, making Evernight one of her best batteries. Aside from this, Evernight also brings her a ton of damage amping buffs, which significantly improves Netherwings and casteries' damage as a whole. And as an added bonus, Evernight also deals a lot of damage as a sub-DPS. So if you pair them together with Hyacinth or the RMC, who also gets buffed by Evernight, you'll have a team full of members fully capable of dealing good damage. But moving on to the RMC, who provides her with all the benefits of them being a Remembrance unit, while being a staple in her main DPS teams. But aside from this, due to Evernight's high 240 energy cost, Evernight and Evie can get the full 20% true damage multipliers from the RMC, which of course results in big damage Evie explosions. And this is without considering the buffs from the RMC's potential Lightcones, the Penacony set, Broken Keel, and more, which boosts Evernight's damage even further. But the neat thing is, due to Evernight's buffs and her giving a copious amounts of crit damage to Memo Sprites, it also enables Mem to deal more damage. Aside from this, their action advance when timed well can enable you to execute 2 Evernight skills in a row before Evie's explosion, allowing you to easily get extremely high Memoria stacks. Now to do this consistently, save the RMC's ult up until you have 60% Mem charge, after which, use it during Evernight's turn to have Mem action advance her right after her first skill and before Evie's first turn. This should result in a very high Memoria stack Evie explosion, especially if you execute this during the darkest riddle state. But it is worth noting that there is one downside to the RMC, and that is there a single target buffer. And since the Casteries plus Evernight comp is a duo DPS team, where both DPSs contribute significantly to the overall team damage output, it's much more ideal to run a team-wide buffer like 3B in that team. Now let's move on to Hyacinth, who also provides the same benefits to Evernight as the RMC and Casteries when it comes to being a Remembrance unit. But the neat thing is, due to her frequent turns, her Memo Sprite acts a lot, meaning she generates way more energy and Memoria for Evernight compared to any other unit. Now if you have her signature, its HP drain also significantly improves Evernight's Memoria generation. She goes from generating 1 Memoria per turn all the way up to 3 to 5 Memoria no matter what ability you use with her. It's also worth noting that Hyacinth's on-damage healing helps offset Evernight's HP drain, which is not only great for helping with survivability, but to also provide a ton more HP fluctuations for casteries. As we also know, Hyacinth's Memo Sprite is also capable of dealing good damage. So with Evernight's offensive buffs, it becomes even easier for little Ika to deal with enemy waves or deal good damage to a boss. It's also very important to note that in order to get the 3 recommended Remembrance units for a main DPS Evernight team, Hyacinth is required. Now Evernight can still be used as a main DPS without Hyacinth, but there will definitely be a noticeable drop in damage and energy or Memoria generation, especially if you don't have Evernight's signature. If you're wondering if she works well with Aglaya, because she is a Remembrance unit after all, well, despite Garment Maker being able to generate tons of Memoria and energy, there's quite a bit of issues, so the pairing isn't really recommended. First of all, Aglaya's damage doesn't just mainly come from her Memo Sprite, with her also contributing a ton herself due to how her joint attack works. So Evernight only buffing Garment Maker isn't really too ideal. Second, Evernight doesn't really do anything to help solve Aglaya's energy problems. She much prefers to be ran with action advancers like Sunday and Robin, or energy supports like Wohwo, especially at E0. Now for the best supports to run in Evernight teams, non-attack team-wide supports like 3B, Rowan May, Cypher, Silverwolf, and Pella are the best to run with her. With 3B of course being the best due to her insane buffs and her ability to spam DDD to help Evernight generate more Memoria and energy, which is helpful for ult uptime if you don't have Evernight's signature. Just a small note for Silverwolf, her 20% Res Shred is only for the element of the weakness she implanted, which of course isn't too ideal for Casteries plus Evernight comps, but her other debuff should be able to compensate for it, and she should still be a great character to run in a main DPS Evernight team. Now if you're wondering about Sunday, since he is the premier summon support, well sadly he doesn't work too well with Evernight. This is because a lot of the time when it comes to Evernight's turns, Evie is dead, especially when the darkest riddle state is active. Meaning, Sunday can't consistently buff Evie, which isn't too ideal because Evi is literally Evernight's main damage source. And unlike Casteries, where you can delay her dragon exploding, Evi has a forced explosion, which makes it harder to get Sunday's buff on it. But even if you do manage to buff Evi, it's terrible for buff uptime since Evi will explode shortly after, completely wiping Sunday's buffs. But aside from this, due to Evernight's volatile speed buff, it's really difficult to speed tune Sunday to Evernight. Meaning, unlike with the RMC, it's very difficult to execute Evernight's double skill combo with Sunday. But with that being said, let's move on to teams, with Evernight having two playstyles. You can either have her as a sub DPS for Casteries or as a main DPS carry. As for a Casteries sub DPS, her best team is one with Casteries, 3B, and Hyacinth, which makes up one of the best teams currently in the game, capable of clearing any content with ease. But if you don't have 3B, other team-wide damage amping supports can work too, like Rowan May, Cypher, Silver Wolf, and Bella. Now the RMC works too, but it's very important to note that with them, most of the team's damage will end up coming mainly from Casteries, since the RMC is only able to consistently buff one unit at a time. Now if you don't have Hyacinth, Luocha or Gallagher can work as replacements, but the RMC does become necessary for the team. This is because you'll need them to prevent Evernight's trace crit damage from going down to 10% from 50% to not lose out on too much damage from both Evernight and Casteries. But moving on to the main DPS team, well, her best one consists of the RMC, 3B, and Hyacinth. The RMC is pretty much a staple for this team for Evernight's Remembrance trace, while 3B again is replaceable with units like Silver Wolf, Cypher, or Rowan May. However, Hyacinth on the other hand is a unit that becomes much harder to replace because not having her does cause a big damage drop-off, which results from you dropping below 3 Remembrance units, meaning less crit damage from Evernight's trace and less Memoria and energy generation, especially if you don't have Evernight's signature or another way to help generate energy or Memoria like Quid Pro Quo, DDD, or the RMC with Hyacinth signature. Now you can still use healers like Gallagher just fine in a main DPS Evernight comp and still be able to clear content. But you should expect slower clears, especially once endgame content stops directly favoring her. Now that's about it, which just leaves one last question.
Is she a must pull?
Well, honestly, it depends on your account. If you don't have Casteries or Hyacinth, I wouldn't really say she's a must pull. As of now, we only have a few Remembrance units that can help her reach her full potential as both a DPS and a sub DPS. So not having either of them really hurts Evernight's performance, resulting from less energy and Memoria gains, which end up resulting in less damage and slower clears. You'll end up having to put in more effort to compensate for not having them in order to make her work effectively, especially once the endgame stops favoring her. Now we'll have to wait if Cyrene will make Evernight less reliant on these two, since she is another Remembrance unit. But since her kit hasn't been revealed yet, it's too early to make that judgment. But speaking of which, in this case, it's much better to roll for characters you like or ones that will improve your account. And saving isn't really a bad idea either, since Cyrene is coming out on the patch after Evernight and the 4.x patches is less than half a year away. However, on the other hand, Evernight is definitely a good pull if you have either Hyacinth or Casteries. She's able to improve Casteries' performance significantly through faster new bud generation and insane buffs that enable her Netherwing to deal significantly more damage. This of course is all on top of Evernight also dealing good damage as a sub DPS and her buffing Memo spread significantly, allowing other team members like Hyacinth to also deal good damage. Aside from this, she is also able to function as a high damage main DPS that is able to compete with the current DPSs we have, especially if you have the proper units to enable her to do so. And this is without considering her insane Lightcone and Eidolons, which makes her a neat unit to vertically invest into. It's also worth noting that due to her innate synergy with the Remembrance units, her future value might increase once we get more of them in the future that can help bring out Evernight's full potential. But at the end of the day, if you like Evernight, pull for her, and if you don't, well don't. Personally, I'm definitely gonna be pulling for her cause I really like her character and design, plus I've been a March fan since day one. I can fix her! No! She can fix me! But anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcases, and remember, I really suck at this game.